Well, when world leaders meet in Copenhagen in December, a sticking point in climate talks will be the amount of CO2 reductions expected from emerging economies. Two representatives from those two countries, Mexico and India, spoke at the Center for Clean Air Policy in Washington. Clean Sky's Lee Patrick Sullivan was there and has more. Lee.
Well, Susan, when the U.S. Senate voted 95-0 on a resolution in opposition to the Kyoto Protocol, one of the main reasons given by senators was the lack of commitment of CO2 reductions from countries like China, India, and Mexico. Representatives from two developing economies were on hand at the Center for Clean Air Policy to discuss their roles in the upcoming climate talks in Copenhagen. The center's president, Ned Helms, says don't expect a repeat of Kyoto in Denmark. He says this time countries will try to make realistic targets, and the tide has shifted in the U.S. Congress towards accepting some sort of international treaty.
I think times have changed. I think countries are much more aware of what their limits are and where they can go. So I think whereas we were a lot guessing what targets we could take and what the implications would be, this time I think there's a lot more analysis been done by all the countries, and they're really ready to talk specifically about what they can live with.
Large countries with huge growth potential will be pivotal during the talks. India, in particular, has more than 30% of its population without electricity, so there's a need for more energy. But because of the density of their cities and a reliance on public transportation, Indians already use less energy and emit less carbon per capita than their Western counterparts.
The range is about 2.5 to 3.5 tons per capita, whereas the world average right now is over 4. So India, in fact, the Prime Minister has said that India will always remain below the Annex I countries' path in terms of per capita emissions. So yes, you're right that India has large development needs, so we would need to increase emissions, but we can do it in a far more efficient way. And Annex I can definitely help India by technology and funds.
As for Mexico, they've been in talks with U.S. border states about reducing emissions that quite often carry over into the U.S., making it difficult for states like Arizona, California, and Texas to pass EPA air quality standards. In June, the Mexican president agreed to cut his country's emissions by 50 million tons by the year 2012 and will bring those reduction targets to Copenhagen.
And we had successful talks more with local governments of the U.S., with state governments, which were willing to develop actions on mitigation. Now that we have listened to this new position of the federal government of the U.S., we are expecting good things that could happen in the international negotiations towards Copenhagen.
Emerging economies will be watching the Hill for progress on the Waxman-Markey legislation and how much of the bill will emerge from a Senate version as a possible U.S. framework for Copenhagen talks.
I think so. I mean, Waxman-Markey has a lot of very good international provisions. It includes a target for us, but it also includes a significant target where we're going to invest in activity in deforestation, in technology and adaptation in developing countries. And those will be reductions that also benefit the atmosphere. So we're really saying a different message here. We're saying we'll do our part in the U.S. and we'll also help finance others to take those actions that are needed. And I think that's the message that's needed at Copenhagen. So if we can move the Waxman-Markey bill in the Senate, I think that's a very positive story, a very positive message for us to be transmitting to the world.
And Susan, to touch on something that Dan brought up earlier, Ned Helms says he also thinks that the U.S. Congress doesn't have to pass climate legislation before Copenhagen, but he does think the bill needs to get out of committee so President Obama will have a framework to present. Susan?
All right, Lee Patrick Sullivan, thank you.